When Mason Hale found a woman abandoned at his gate that frozen November night, he made a choice that would shatter everything he knew about survival, love, and second chances. She wasn't young. She wasn't desperate. Lady Eleanor Whitmore, a 52-year-old widow discarded like trash by the man who promised her marriage, stood in the Montana darkness with wolves circling and death waiting. Mason had sworn never to let another soul into his life, but some decisions can't be unmade. If you want to see how a love nobody believed in became the most powerful force in Paradise Valley, stay until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind came down off the mountains like a knife, cutting through the November darkness with a sound that made men check their doors twice. Mason Hale stood on his porch, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, watching the wagon disappear into the tree line. It shouldn't have bothered him. Wagons came and went. The Montana frontier didn't ask questions. It just took what it wanted and moved on. But something was wrong. The wagon had stopped at his gate, long enough for voices to carry across the frozen ground. A man's voice, sharp and dismissive. A woman's reply, too quiet to make out the words, but clear enough in tone. Controlled. Dangerously calm. Then the wagon lurched forward and kept going, leaving something behind, someone. Mason set down his cup and stepped off the porch, boots crunching on frost-hardened earth. The cold bit through his shirt, but he'd stopped feeling cold the way other men did. 3 years alone on this ranch had burned out most of what made him soft. The figure at his gate didn't move. Not toward the house, not back toward the road. Just standing there in the blue-black twilight, perfectly still, like she was waiting for the mountains themselves to make the next decision. Mason's hand dropped to the rifle he wasn't carrying. Old habit, stupid habit. He walked closer, slow enough to be careful, fast enough that the cold wouldn't kill her before he figured out what the hell was happening. When he got within 10 feet, she turned. Not startled, not afraid, just turned, like she'd known exactly where he was the entire time. "Good evening," she said. Mason stopped walking. The woman in front of him was maybe 50, maybe older, hard to tell in the failing light. She wore a traveling dress that had seen better days, dark wool with careful patches at the elbows. Her hair was pulled back severe and gray-streaked, and her face carried the kind of lines that came from smiling once, a long time ago, before life taught her not to waste the effort. But it was her eyes that made him forget how to speak for a second. Not broken, not pleading, furious. "I apologize for the intrusion," she continued, her accent clipped and precise. East Coast money, the kind that didn't apologize for anything unless it was sharpening a knife. "I was informed this property belonged to a man willing to honor arrangements made in good faith. I see now that information was optimistic." Mason found his voice. "Who the hell are you?" "Lady Eleanor Whitmore." She said it the way other people said good morning, a fact, not a boast. "Recently widowed, recently deceived, recently abandoned at your gate by a man whose name I will not dignify with repetition. He just left you here?" "He did." "Why?" Her smile was thin and sharp enough to draw blood. "Because I am 52 years old, Mr. Hale. Because I carry myself with what he deemed excessive formality. Because I did not weep or beg when he informed me the marriage arrangement was void. Take your pick." The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of wolves testing their voices against the night. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "I understand if you'd prefer I leave. I have no claim on your hospitality, but I would appreciate knowing which direction leads to the nearest town before the light fails entirely." Mason looked past her, toward the dirt road disappearing into darkness. Paradise Valley was 8 miles south. 8 miles of frozen ground, deadfall timber, and pack hunters looking for anything stupid enough to travel alone. She wouldn't make it 2 miles. "Town's too far," he said. "I see. And you won't make it before dark." "I assumed as much." She adjusted her grip on the small leather case at her side, the only luggage she had, apparently. "Then I'll walk as far as I can and make camp. I've done it before." It was a lie. A good one, delivered with enough conviction that she almost believed it herself. But Mason had spent 3 years learning how to spot the difference between people who knew how to survive and people who just thought they did. "No, you haven't," he said. For the first time, something cracked in her composure. Not much, just a flicker of exhaustion behind those furious eyes. "Perhaps not, but I'll learn quickly." She would die quickly. That's what would happen. Mason looked at her. Really looked. 52 years old. Gray in her hair, lines in her face, abandoned by some spineless bastard who'd probably made promises all the way from Boston or Philadelphia or wherever the hell she came from, then decided she wasn't worth the trouble once he got a good look at her age. The smart thing to do was point her toward town and let her make her own choices. The smart thing. Mason Hale hadn't done the smart thing since the day he buried his wife and daughter and swore he'd never let himself care about another living soul. "Gates open," he said. "House is that way. You can stay the night, leave in the morning if you want." Eleanor didn't move. "Why?" "Because the wolves will kill you, and I'm too tired to bury another body before winter." It was cruel. He meant it to be. She smiled anyway. A real smile this time, small and bitter and almost amused. "How practical. I appreciate honesty, Mr. Hale. It's been in short supply lately." She walked past him toward the house, back straight, head high, like she was entering a ballroom instead of a half-finished ranch house in the middle of nowhere. Mason watched her go, already regretting the decision. Then he followed her inside and started a fire. The house was small, 2 rooms and a loft that Mason hadn't used since the day he stopped sleeping in beds. Eleanor took it all in with the same measured calm she'd shown at the gate, like she was cataloging assets in a ledger. "You live here alone," she said. Not a question. "Yeah." "How long?" 3 years. She nodded, running one gloved hand along the rough-hewn table near the fireplace. "It shows. Not neglect, just absence." Mason didn't answer. He was too busy trying to remember where he'd put the coffee that wasn't 6 months old. Eleanor set her case down carefully, then removed her gloves with the kind of precision that came from a lifetime of doing small things correctly. Her hands were pale and thin-fingered, the hands of someone who'd never worked a day outside in her life. They were also shaking. Not much, but enough. "Sit down," Mason said, sharper than he meant to, "before you fall down." She glanced at him, something almost like humor flickering across her face. "I don't fall down, Mr. Hale. I've been thrown from horses, dismissed from social functions, and tonight abandoned in the wilderness, but I don't fall down." "Great, sit anyway." She sat. Mason poured 2 cups of coffee, strong, bitter, and probably older than he'd like to admit, and set one in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it and didn't drink, just held it like the warmth was the only thing keeping her bones together. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. Wind rattled the windows. Somewhere outside, something howled, high and thin and hungry. Eleanor's grip on the cup tightened, but she didn't look toward the sound. "Thank you," she said finally. "For what?" "For not leaving me to die. I know it wasn't kindness, but I'll take practicality over cruelty any day." Mason sat down across from her, his own coffee untouched. "You want to tell me what happened?" "Not particularly." She took a slow sip, then winced. "This is dreadful." "Yeah?" "I'll drink it anyway." "Yeah." Another silence, longer this time. Eleanor stared into the fire, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and carefully empty. "I was married for 28 years. My husband was a banker, successful, respected, unfaithful in the way men of his station often are. I tolerated it because I had 2 daughters to raise and a household to manage. When he died last year, I discovered he'd left me nothing. The estate went to his brother. The investments were gone. Everything I'd built was smoke." Mason listened without interrupting. "I received a letter 3 months ago," she continued, "from a Mr. Howard Cartwright, recently widowed, seeking a woman of maturity and refinement to assist in managing his ranch and raising his children. He promised marriage, security, and respect." Her smile was thin and poisonous. "I sold the last of my jewelry to pay for passage west. I traveled 2,000 miles. And tonight, when he saw me step off that stagecoach, when he saw my age, my bearing, the way I refused to simper or pretend to be something I'm not, he informed me the arrangement was no longer suitable." "Because you're 52. "Because I'm 52, Mr. Hale. Because I didn't weep at his feet. Because I had the audacity to look him in the eye and ask what had changed since his letters promised otherwise." She set down her cup with a sharp click. "He put me in that wagon, told the driver to leave me anywhere, and paid him enough to ensure he wouldn't ask questions." Mason's jaw tightened. "Cartwright, he runs the feed store in town." I don't care what he runs. You should. He's got friends, money. People listen to him. Eleanor looked at him directly, and for the first time Mason saw past the fury to something colder and far more dangerous. Then they'll listen when I destroy him. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Mason believed her. You can't destroy a man like that without proof, he said carefully. Letters won't be enough. You need witnesses, records, something that makes people choose sides. Then I'll find it. She stood up, smoothing her skirt with deliberate precision. But first, I need to survive the night. If you have blankets to spare, I'll sleep near the fire. I won't intrude on your space more than necessary. Loft's yours, Mason said. I don't use it. Where do you sleep? I don't. It was the truth. He slept in the chair near the fire most nights, rifle across his lap, waiting for dawn. Sleep was a thing other men did. Men who didn't see their wives and daughters in every shadow. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and Mason had the uncomfortable feeling she saw more than he wanted her to. Then I'll take the loft. Thank you, Mr. Hale. She picked up her case and climbed the ladder with careful, practiced movements. Mason heard the creak of boards overhead, the soft sound of her settling in. He sat alone by the fire, coffee cooling in his hands, and wondered what the hell he'd just done. Morning came cold and gray, the kind of dawn that felt like the world hadn't decided whether to bother waking up at all. Mason was already outside when Eleanor descended from the loft, her hair pinned back and her dress smoothed despite having slept in it. She looked tired, deeply, bone-tired, but her spine was straight and her eyes were clear. "Good morning," she said. Mason grunted something that might have been a greeting. Eleanor walked to the window and looked out at the frost-covered valley, the distant mountains rising like broken teeth against the sky. It's beautiful. Harsh, but beautiful. It'll kill you if you let it. Most beautiful things do. She turned back to him. I'll leave this morning, as promised. If you could point me toward town, I'll manage the rest. Mason set down the pot he'd been scrubbing and faced her. And then what? I'll find work. A boarding house. Something. Doing what? Her smile was sharp. I can read, write, keep accounts, teach etiquette, manage a household, and navigate social politics that would make your frontier negotiations look like a children's game. I'm certain I'll find something, Mr. Hale. Not in Paradise Valley, you won't. Why not? Because Cartwright's already been there, told everyone you were unstable, difficult, that he tried to help you out of charity and you repaid him with threats. Mason watched her face carefully. By now, the whole town thinks you're a problem looking for a place to land. Eleanor went very still. I see. You don't see. You think this is Boston. You think people will listen to reason, that you can charm or argue your way into a fair hearing. He shook his head. Out here, the man who speaks first wins, and Cartwright spoke first. For the first time since she'd arrived, Mason saw her composure crack. Not much, just a tightening around her eyes, a tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite control. Then I have nothing, she said quietly. No money, no prospects, no way forward. You've got one way. She looked at him, wary. Which is? Stay here. The words hung in the cold air between them. Eleanor laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. Stay here, on your ranch. And do what exactly? Impose on your hospitality indefinitely while the town gossips about the desperate widow living with the hermit rancher? Teach, Mason said. There's a schoolhouse in town, half-built, never used because they can't find anyone willing to run it. You want to prove Cartwright wrong? Show the town you're not unstable or useless? Give their kids something they can't get anywhere else. They'll never accept me. Maybe not, but their kids will. He crossed his arms. You stay here, works at the school, prove you're not what Cartwright said. When winter breaks, you'll have options. Leave if you want, but you'll leave with money and a reputation that isn't built on lies. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Why would you do this? Because Cartwright's a coward and a liar, and I don't like cowards. That's not enough reason. Mason met her eyes. Then because you remind me of someone who didn't break when she should have. And I'm tired of watching people break. It was more truth than he'd spoken in 3 years. Eleanor's face softened, just slightly, just enough. If I stay, I work. I pay my way. I won't be charity, Mr. Hale. Fine. And I don't need saving. I need time, space, a chance to rebuild. I'm not trying to save you. Mason turned back to the fire. I'm just trying to keep the wolves from eating you before you figure out whether you want to rebuild or burn everything down. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, very well. I'll stay. For now. Good. She moved to the door, pausing with her hand on the frame. Mr. Hale? Yeah? What happened to her? The woman who didn't break? Mason's throat tightened. She died anyway. Eleanor nodded slowly. I'm sorry. She stepped outside, leaving Mason alone with the fire and the weight of memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. By midday, Eleanor had already reorganized his kitchen. Mason discovered this when he came in from checking fences and found every pot, pan, and utensil arranged with military precision. The table was scrubbed clean. The windows, which he hadn't realized were dirty, now let in actual sunlight. Eleanor stood at the stove, somehow coaxing edible food from ingredients he'd forgotten he owned. What are you doing? He asked. Cooking. She didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. You had flour, salt pork, and what I believe were once potatoes. I'm making the best of it. I didn't ask you to. I don't require permission to be useful, Mr. Hale. It's how I survive. She glanced at him. You're welcome to eat elsewhere if my presence offends you. It didn't offend him. It unsettled him, which was worse. He sat down at the table without answering. Eleanor served 2 plates. Simple food, nothing fancy, but hot and properly seasoned. They ate in silence, the kind of quiet that felt less hostile and more like 2 people who'd forgotten how to make small talk. When they finished, Eleanor cleared the dishes with the same efficient precision she brought to everything else. Mason watched her move around the kitchen, careful, controlled, never wasting emotion. You don't have to do this, he said finally. I know. I mean it. You're not a servant. Eleanor turned to face him, drying her hands on a cloth. Mr. Hale, I've spent 30 years managing households, hosting dinners, and ensuring every detail met impossible standards. This, she gestured around the kitchen, is the first time in a year I've felt remotely useful. So yes, I do have to do this. Not for you, for myself. Mason nodded slowly. Fair enough. Besides, she added, a hint of dry humor in her voice, your coffee is undrinkable. Your kitchen was a disaster, and I suspect you've been living on salt pork and bitterness for 3 years. Someone had to intervene. Despite himself, Mason almost smiled. Bitterness keeps you warm. So does proper food and basic hygiene. I'm plenty hygienic. Eleanor's look said otherwise. Mason stood up, suddenly uncomfortable with the way this conversation felt almost normal. I'm going to town. Need to pick up supplies, talk to the schoolhouse board. You want to come, or you want to stay here? I'll come. Her voice was firm. If I'm going to teach those children, I should see the space, and meet the people who'll decide whether I'm worthy of the position. They're going to be, difficult. Good. I prefer obstacles to pity. Mason grabbed his coat and hat. Don't say I didn't warn you. Paradise Valley wasn't much of a town. A single dirt road lined with wooden buildings that looked like they might blow away in a strong wind. The feed store. The general store. A saloon that doubled as a meeting hall. And at the far end, half hidden behind overgrown grass, the schoolhouse. It was smaller than Eleanor expected, and in worse condition. The roof sagged in the middle. Windows were cracked. The door hung crooked on its hinges. This is it? She asked. Yeah. It's a ruin. Yeah. Eleanor walked closer, her boots crunching on frozen grass. She pushed open the door. It resisted, scraping across warped floorboards, and stepped inside. The interior was dim and smelled of mildew and old wood. Broken benches were shoved against the walls. Bird droppings covered the floor. A blackboard leaned in the corner, cracked down the middle. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. It's perfect, she said. Mason, standing in the doorway, raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Absolutely. She ran her hand along one of the benches, testing its stability. It's broken, neglected, and no one expects it to become anything. That makes it exactly the kind of challenge I need. Before Mason could respond, voices drifted in from outside. Men's voices, curious and wary. That Hale? What's he doing here? Who's the woman? Mason stepped out onto the porch, Eleanor following close behind. 3 men stood in the road, farmers by the look of them, weathered and suspicious. One of them Mason recognized, Thomas Brennan, a man who worked land north of town and served on the schoolhouse board. Brennan, Mason said, nodding. Hale. Brennan's eyes shifted to Eleanor. Ma'am. Eleanor inclined her head, perfectly polite and utterly unreadable. What brings you to town? Brennan asked, his tone careful. The schoolhouse, Mason said. Heard you're still looking for a teacher. Brennan's expression darkened. We are, but we're being careful about who we bring in. Can't have just anyone teaching our kids. This is Lady Eleanor Whitmore, Mason continued, ignoring the implication. She's qualified, experienced, and available. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Finally, one of the other men, younger, with a mean twist to his mouth, spoke up. That the woman Cartwright was talking about? The one who caused all that trouble? Eleanor's face didn't change, but Mason saw the way her hands tightened at her sides. Cartwright lied, Mason said flatly. The young man snorted. That's not what he says. Says she threatened him, called him all kinds of names when he tried to help her out. Did he mention, Eleanor said, her voice cold and precise, that he promised me marriage in writing, accepted payment for my passage, then abandoned me at a stranger's gate because I didn't meet his expectations? The men shifted uncomfortably. People say all kinds of things when they're upset, Brennan said carefully. Hard to know what's true. Then allow me to clarify. Eleanor stepped forward, and Mason saw the exact moment she transformed from a tired widow into something else entirely, something sharp and commanding and impossible to ignore. Mr. Cartwright is a liar and a coward. He made promises he had no intention of keeping, and when confronted with his dishonesty, he chose slander over accountability. If you wish to believe him over me, that is your choice, but know that your children will suffer for it. That a threat? The young man demanded. It's a fact. Eleanor's gaze swept across all 3 of them. This town has an empty schoolhouse and children who can't read past a primer. You need a teacher. I need work. We can help each other, or you can continue allowing Mr. Cartwright's lies to dictate your decisions. I'll leave the choice to you. She turned and walked back toward Mason's wagon, her spine straight and her head high. The men watched her go, silent and uncertain. Mason looked at Brennan. You want a teacher or not? Brennan rubbed his jaw, clearly torn. We'll discuss it. Board meets next week. We'll let you know. You do that. Mason followed Eleanor to the wagon and found her standing beside it, arms crossed, staring at the mountains with an expression that could have cut glass. They won't choose me, she said quietly. Maybe not. Then I've wasted your time. Not yet. Mason climbed into the driver's seat. They're going to discuss it. That means they're thinking. That's more than Cartwright gave them. Eleanor pulled herself up beside him, moving with the stiff precision of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. I don't beg, Mr. Hale. Not anymore. Good. Begging doesn't work out here anyway. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the sun sinking low and cold behind them. That night, Eleanor didn't speak during dinner. She cleaned the dishes, retired to the loft, and left Mason alone with the fire and the growing certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake. Not in bringing her here, in letting himself care whether she stayed. The board met on Thursday, which gave Eleanor 6 days to prove she wasn't what Cartwright said she was. She started with the schoolhouse. Mason found her there on the second morning, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing bird droppings off the floor with a brush she'd somehow conjured from his supplies. Her hair was tied back with a strip of cloth, and her face was flushed from exertion. What are you doing? He asked from the doorway. Cleaning. She didn't look up. If they're going to reject me, it won't be because I didn't try. You don't have to. Yes, Mr. Hale, I do. She sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of gray hair out of her face. I have 6 days to transform this ruin into something resembling a school, I have no money, no references they'll believe, and a reputation built on lies. The only thing I can control is this building, so I'm controlling it." Mason watched her work for a moment. The methodical way she moved, the stubborn set of her jaw. "You need help?" Eleanor glanced up, surprise flickering across her face. "You're offering?" "Tools are in the wagon, lumber's at the ranch. Roof needs fixing before winter or the whole place collapses." "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." She studied him, those sharp eyes searching for something he wasn't sure he wanted her to find. "Why?" "Because Cartwright's a bastard, and I don't like watching him win." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough of it. Eleanor stood, wiping her hands on her apron, one of his old shirts she'd somehow converted into something useful. "Then I accept. Thank you." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Mason repaired the roof while Eleanor scrubbed, swept, and salvaged what furniture could be saved. The broken benches became firewood. The cracked blackboard got replaced with a sheet of slate Mason found in his barn, left over from a project he'd abandoned years ago. By sunset, the schoolhouse looked less like a ruin and more like a possibility. Eleanor stood in the doorway, surveying their work with an expression Mason couldn't quite read. Satisfaction, maybe. Or exhaustion wearing the mask of pride. "It's not finished," she said quietly. "It's better. Better isn't good enough. Out here, better is all we've got." She turned to him, and for a moment something passed between them, not gratitude exactly, more like recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to rebuild from broken pieces. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "Early." "I know." They rode home in silence, the wagon rattling over frozen ground. When they reached the ranch, Eleanor climbed down without waiting for help and disappeared into the house. Mason stayed outside, unhitching the horses, trying to figure out when exactly he'd stopped thinking of her as a problem and started thinking of her as something else entirely. The next morning, she was gone before dawn. Mason found her at the schoolhouse, already working. She'd brought supplies from the house: cloth for curtains, books from the small collection she'd carried in her case, a battered globe she must have found in some forgotten corner. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, nodding at the globe. "Your attic. I hope you don't mind." He didn't even know he had an attic. "It's yours." Eleanor positioned the globe carefully on what would become her desk, a table Mason had reinforced the day before. "When I was young, my father kept a globe in his study. He used to spin it and tell me that the world was full of places I'd never see. He was right, of course, but I always liked knowing they existed." "You seeing them now?" She smiled, small and sad. "I'm seeing Montana. That's more than I expected 6 months ago." Before Mason could respond, footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. They both turned to find a woman standing in the doorway, small, thin, with a baby on her hip and 2 children clinging to her skirts. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice hesitant. "I didn't mean to intrude. I heard someone was fixing up the school." Eleanor straightened, her expression shifting into something polite and careful. "You're not intruding. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. And you are?" "Mary Sullivan. These are my children, Patrick and Anna." She gestured to the 2 kids, both of whom stared at Eleanor with wide, suspicious eyes. "I heard Mr. Cartwright talking at the store about you." Eleanor's face went very still. "I see. He said you were trouble, that you weren't fit to teach." Mary shifted the baby higher on her hip, her voice dropping. "But Patrick's 8 years old and can't read more than his name. Anna's 6 and knows her letters, but nothing else. And I don't know how to teach them more than that." The silence stretched long enough that Mason started to wonder if Eleanor would answer at all. Then she knelt down, bringing herself level with the children. "Patrick, Anna, do you want to learn to read?" Patrick nodded slowly. Anna just stared. "Then you'll learn," Eleanor said simply. "If the board approves me as your teacher, you'll learn to read, write, and calculate numbers. You'll learn geography, history, and how to think for yourselves. And if they don't approve me," she glanced up at Mary, "then I'll teach you anyway, in this building or elsewhere. I give you my word." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I haven't earned it." But Mary was already ushering her children forward, pointing out the globe, the slate board, the shelves Eleanor had started organizing with books. The children's suspicion melted into curiosity, their small hands reaching for things they'd never seen before. Mason watched Eleanor guide them through the space, her voice patient and precise, answering questions with the kind of seriousness that treated children like people instead of nuisances. When the Sullivan family finally left, Eleanor stood in the empty schoolhouse, her arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something fragile together. "That was risky," Mason said. "Making promises you might not be able to keep. I know. Board might say no. Cartwright might. I don't care what Cartwright might do, Mr. Hale." Eleanor turned to face him, and the fury was back in her eyes. Controlled, cold, absolute. "That woman's children deserve an education. If the men in this town are too cowardly to provide it, then I'll do it myself. And if they run you out, then I'll have tried." She moved to the window, looking out at the dirt road leading back to town. "I spent 30 years doing what was expected of me. Being appropriate. Being quiet. Accepting that my worth was measured by my husband's status and my ability to host dinner parties without embarrassing anyone." Her voice hardened. "I'm done with that. If I'm going to fail, I'll fail doing something that matters." Mason had spent 3 years avoiding anything that mattered. It was safer that way. Easier. Standing in that half-fixed schoolhouse, listening to a 52-year-old widow declare war on propriety, he realized exactly how much of a coward that made him. "I'll help," he said. Eleanor looked at him sharply. "You've already helped more than with the teaching. If the board says yes, you'll need supplies, books, paper, someone to vouch for you when Cartwright starts spreading more lies." He met her eyes. "I'm offering." "Why?" It was the third time she'd asked him that question. The third time he didn't have a good answer. "Because Mary Sullivan's kids deserve better," he said finally. "And so do you." Eleanor's expression softened, just slightly. "That's not enough reason for you to put yourself at risk. Cartwright has influence. If you align yourself with me, I don't give a damn about Cartwright. You should. Men like him don't forget slights." "Good. I'm tired of being forgotten." The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. 3 years of hiding. 3 years of choosing absence over presence, silence over connection. Maybe Eleanor wasn't the only one who was done with that. She studied him for a long moment, and Mason had the uncomfortable feeling she saw straight through every wall he'd built. "Very well. I accept your help. But understand, I don't need protection, Mr. Hale. I need partnership. I need someone who treats me like an equal, not a charity case. You think I'd be here if I thought you needed protection?" A smile ghosted across her face, real, brief, startling. "No, I suppose you wouldn't be." They worked until dark, then rode back to the ranch. Eleanor cooked dinner, something involving the chickens she'd discovered in his barn and vegetables she'd somehow grown in the small garden plot behind the house. "When did you plant those?" Mason asked, staring at the carrots on his plate. 3 days ago, I found seeds. Yesterday, I planted them. Today, I harvested what was ready." She served herself a modest portion. "Your soil is better than you think. You've just been ignoring it." "I've been ignoring a lot of things. I've noticed." They ate in silence, the kind that had started to feel less like avoidance and more like understanding. When Mason finally spoke, his voice was rougher than he intended. "My wife's name was Catherine. My daughter was Elizabeth. She was 4. Eleanor's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Fever took them both," Mason continued, staring at his plate. "Winter of '72. I was in town getting supplies. Came back to an empty house and 2 graves I had to dig myself." He forced himself to look up. "I swore I'd never care about anyone again. Safer that way." "Is it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Safer? Don't know yet." She set down her fork, her expression unreadable. "I'm not your wife, Mr. Hale. I'm not your second chance at happiness or some tragic figure who needs rescuing from grief. I'm a woman who's trying to survive long enough to rebuild something resembling a life." "I know that." "Do you?" "Because I need to be very clear. I can't be anyone's salvation. I'm too broken for that. Too old. Too angry." Mason almost laughed. Almost. "You think I'm looking for salvation? I'm looking to get through the day without hating every damn thing about it. You make that easier. Don't ask me why." Eleanor's face went very soft, the anger bleeding out of it. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in years. Yeah, well, don't get used to it. But the truth was, he was getting used to it. Used to her presence in his kitchen, used to the sound of her moving around the loft at night, used to the way she looked at him like he was someone worth talking to instead of someone worth avoiding. It terrified him. The board meeting was set for Thursday evening at the saloon, which doubled as the town hall when anyone needed to make decisions about anything important. Eleanor spent the day preparing. She wrote out a curriculum on paper Mason had bought from the general store. She organized her few books into categories. She practiced her introduction in front of the small mirror in the loft, her voice steady and professional. Mason watched her from below, ostensibly fixing a broken chair, but mostly just listening to her rehearse the same speech over and over, each time with a different emphasis. "You're going to do fine," he called up finally. Eleanor's face appeared at the edge of the loft. "You don't know that." "I know they need a teacher. I know their kids need what you're offering. That's enough." "It's not enough if they're too proud to accept it." She wasn't wrong. They left for town at sunset, the wagon rattling over frozen ground. Eleanor sat beside him in her best dress, still worn, still patched, but clean and pressed with a precision that spoke of years managing appearances on a non-existent budget. "I won't beg," she said suddenly. "Good. I mean it. If they reject me, I'll leave with my head up." "Where will you go?" She didn't answer for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "I don't know." The saloon was crowded when they arrived, not just the board members, but half the town. Farmers and their wives, shopkeepers, the blacksmith, even a few of the ranch hands who worked spreads north of Paradise Valley. And there, standing near the bar with a glass of whiskey and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, was Howard Cartwright. He was younger than Mason expected, maybe 40, with the kind of bland good looks that wealthy men wore like armor. His suit was too fine for Montana, his posture too relaxed for someone who had done what he'd done. When he saw Eleanor, his smile widened. "Lady Whitmore, I wasn't sure you'd have the courage to appear." Eleanor's face went blank, perfectly, dangerously blank. "Mr. Cartwright, how kind of you to attend." "Wouldn't miss it. The town deserves to know who they're considering for such an important position." He took a sip of whiskey. After all, our children's futures are at stake. Mason's hand tightened on Eleanor's arm, not to restrain her but to ground her. She didn't need the reminder. Her composure was absolute. "Indeed they are," she said coolly, "which is why I'm certain the board will make the right decision." Thomas Brennan stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Let's get started, shall we? Board's here, town's here, and we've got a decision to make." The crowd settled into an uneasy silence. Brennan gestured to Eleanor. "Lady Whitmore, you've put in a request to teach at the schoolhouse. Board's reviewed your situation. We'd like to hear from you directly before we make a final decision." Eleanor stepped forward, her spine straight and her voice clear. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. I understand you have concerns about my qualifications and character. I'd like to address both." She didn't use notes, didn't hesitate. "I've spent 30 years managing complex households, organizing charitable events, and tutoring young women in literature, mathematics, and proper correspondence. I speak 3 languages. I've studied history, philosophy, and economics. I may not have formal teaching credentials, but I have something more valuable: experience educating children of different ages and abilities." She paused. "As for my character, I'll let my actions speak. I've spent the past week repairing your schoolhouse at my own expense. I've created a curriculum suitable for children aged 5 to 15, and I've given my word to families in this town that their children will receive an education regardless of whether you approve me or not." A murmur ran through the crowd. Cartwright stepped forward, his expression sympathetic and poisonous. "That's a lovely speech, Lady Whitmore, but the board deserves to know the truth about why you're really here." "By all means," Eleanor said, her voice like ice. "Share your version of the truth, Mr. Cartwright." "You came here under false pretenses. You misrepresented yourself in correspondence, claimed qualifications you don't possess, and when I attempted to correct the situation honorably, you responded with threats and hysteria." He turned to the crowd. "I tried to help this woman. I offered her employment as a housekeeper, honest work, appropriate for someone in her position. She refused. She demanded marriage, money, status she hadn't earned. When I declined, she became unstable. The crowd shifted, uncertain. Eleanor didn't flinch. Is that truly what happened, Mr. Cartwright? It is. Then perhaps you can explain these. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of letters, yellowed and carefully preserved. Your correspondence from April through September. 37 letters in which you promised marriage, security, and partnership. Letters in which you specifically requested a woman of maturity and refinement. Letters in which you never once mentioned the word housekeeper. The saloon went very quiet. Cartwright's face darkened. Those letters were written in good faith. Circumstances changed. What circumstances? Eleanor's voice cut like a blade. That I was older than you expected? That I refused to weep at your feet when you changed your mind? That I dared to expect you to honor your word? You're twisting. I'm reading. She held up one of the letters. My dear Eleanor, I seek a partner who understands the burdens of leadership and the loneliness of raising children without a mother's guidance. Age is no barrier to companionship. Indeed, I find wisdom more appealing than youth. Your words, Mr. Cartwright. Written June 15th. Shall I continue? Cartwright's jaw tightened. That's private correspondence. You made it public when you slandered my character. Eleanor's eyes swept the crowd. I came here in good faith. I sold everything I owned to pay for passage. I traveled 2,000 miles because a man promised me security and honesty. When I arrived, he took one look at me, decided I wasn't suitable, and abandoned me in the wilderness. Not because I misrepresented myself, but because I refused to be humiliated in silence. Mary Sullivan stepped forward from the back of the room, her voice shaking but clear. She's telling the truth. I heard Mr. Cartwright talking at the store. He said she was too old, too proud, that she looked at him like she was better than him. He laughed about it. Another voice joined in, one of the ranch hands. I was there too. He said he'd rather hire a girl from town than marry some dried-up Eastern widow. Cartwright's face went red. That's taken out of context. What context makes it acceptable? Eleanor's voice was sharp enough to draw blood. You're a liar and a coward, Mr. Cartwright. You prey on vulnerable women and discard them when they don't meet your expectations. The only reason I'm standing here is because Mr. Hale had the decency to offer shelter when you left me to die. Mason felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He met their stares without flinching. That true, Hale? Brennan asked. Cartwright left her at your gate? Yeah. And you took her in? Seemed like the right thing to do. Brennan looked at Cartwright, his expression hardening. That true, Howard? Cartwright straightened his shoulders, trying to regain control. I made a business decision. She wasn't suitable. I had no obligation. You had every obligation. A woman's voice cut in. Mrs. Brennan pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with anger. You made promises in writing. You took her money. You brought her here and threw her away like garbage. Don't you dare stand there and pretend you did the honorable thing. The tide was turning. Mason could see it in the faces around the room. Anger replacing doubt, sympathy replacing suspicion. Cartwright must have seen it too, because his expression shifted from defensive to aggressive. Fine, I made a mistake, but that doesn't make her qualified to teach our children. She's a bitter, angry woman with nothing to her name. What kind of example is that? Eleanor smiled, cold and sharp and absolutely devastating. The kind of example that teaches your children not to accept cruelty as inevitable. The kind that shows them dignity isn't given by others. It's claimed for yourself. The kind that proves a woman doesn't need a man's approval to have worth. She took a step forward. I am bitter, Mr. Cartwright. I'm angry. I've lost everything, my husband, my home, my security, but I'm still standing, and I will continue standing long after you've been forgotten. The room erupted. Half the crowd was shouting support. The other half was arguing. Cartwright was trying to speak over the noise, his face purple with rage. Brennan raised his hands. Enough! Board needs to vote. Clear the room! Members only! The crowd filed out reluctantly, Eleanor among them. Mason followed, catching her arm as they stepped onto the porch. You did good in there, he said. Eleanor's hands were shaking. I destroyed him. He destroyed himself. You just made sure everyone saw it. She leaned against the porch railing, eyes closed, breathing hard. I've never done that before. Never confronted someone so publicly. How's it feel? Terrifying. She opened her eyes, and to Mason's surprise, she was smiling, a real smile, shaky but genuine, and wonderful. They waited in the cold for 20 minutes. The crowd milled around, speculating, arguing. Mary Sullivan gave Eleanor a tentative smile. A few other women nodded in her direction. Finally, the door opened. Brennan stepped out, his expression unreadable. Lady Whitmore, board's made a decision. Eleanor straightened, her composure sliding back into place. I'm listening. This position's yours. 6-month trial. Salaries $40 a month, paid by the families who send their children. You teach Monday through Friday, 8 to 3. Schoolhouse is yours to manage as you see fit. He paused. But understand, this town's watching. You step wrong, we'll end the arrangement. Clear? Perfectly clear. Eleanor's voice didn't waver. Thank you, Mr. Brennan. You won't regret this. Hope not. He glanced at Mason. You vouching for her, Hale? Yeah? Then I'm trusting your judgment. Don't make me regret that either. Mason nodded. The crowd erupted again, this time in celebration. Mary Sullivan rushed forward, pulling Eleanor into an impulsive hug. Other women followed, offering congratulations, promising to send their children. Eleanor stood in the center of it, overwhelmed and trying desperately not to show it. Mason watched from the edge of the porch, something tight in his chest loosening for the first time in 3 years. She'd won. Not because she'd begged or compromised, because she'd stood her ground and refused to break. They rode home in silence, the stars impossibly bright above them. Eleanor sat beside him, her face turned toward the sky, her expression distant. What are you thinking? Mason asked finally. That I have 48 hours before I need to stand in front of 20 children and prove I'm worth what they're paying me. She glanced at him. That I have no idea what I'm doing. That I'm terrified. You'll figure it out. How do you know? Because you're too stubborn not to. Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, surprised and genuine. That's possibly the worst compliment I've ever received. Didn't say it was a compliment. Then what was it? Mason considered. A fact. They reached the ranch, and Eleanor climbed down from the wagon with movements that spoke of exhaustion, held at bay by sheer will. She paused at the door, one hand on the frame. Thank you, she said quietly. For tonight. For vouching for me. For... She trailed off, searching for words. For not looking at me like I'm broken. You're not broken. I am. Just not in the ways people expect. Mason met her eyes. Yeah, me too. Something passed between them in that moment, recognition deeper than words, understanding that didn't require explanation. Then Eleanor disappeared inside, leaving Mason alone with the cold and the stars and the growing certainty that he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd started to care, and caring, he'd learned the hard way, was the most dangerous thing a man could do. The first day of school arrived with frost on the windows, and 23 children crowding into the schoolhouse like they weren't quite sure whether to be excited or terrified. Eleanor stood at the front of the room in her best dress, hands clasped in front of her, watching them file in with parents who looked equally uncertain. Mary Sullivan gave her an encouraging nod. Thomas Brennan's wife whispered something to her daughter that made the girl sit up straighter. Mason stood in the back corner, arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but refusing to leave. Eleanor cleared her throat. Good morning. My name is Mrs. Whitmore, and I will be your teacher. You may call me Mrs. Whitmore. Not ma'am, not miss, and certainly not that lady from back east. A few of the older kids snickered. We're going to establish some rules, Eleanor continued, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made even the parents pay attention. First, you will arrive on time. Second, you will treat each other with respect. Third, you will work hard. And fourth, most importantly, you will ask questions. I don't care if you think the question is stupid. I don't care if your classmates laugh. If you don't understand something, you ask. Is that clear? A chorus of uncertain yeses. Louder. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Better. She moved to the blackboard, chalk in hand. Now, who can tell me their name and one thing they want to learn this year? The responses came slowly at first. hesitant, embarrassed. But Eleanor treated each answer with the same serious attention, writing names on the board, asking follow-up questions, turning nervous children into individuals with thoughts worth hearing. By the time the parents left, the tension had shifted from fear to something closer to curiosity. Mason watched Eleanor work through the morning, sorting children by age and ability, testing their reading levels with a patience that surprised him, adjusting her lessons on the fly when something wasn't working. She was tough, but not cruel, demanding, but not unreasonable. And the kids responded. Even the troublemakers, the 12-year-old boy who'd come in looking for a fight, the 10-year-old girl who insisted she didn't need school because she could already read, settled into the rhythm Eleanor established. At noon, she dismissed them for lunch. The children scattered outside and Eleanor collapsed into her chair, face pale with exhaustion. Mason approached, carrying the coffee he'd made that morning. "You survived." "Barely." She took the cup with shaking hands. 23 children, 7 different reading levels, 3 who can barely sit still. And one, Patrick Sullivan's younger brother, who's clearly brilliant but has never been challenged in his life. Sounds like a disaster. It's perfect. Eleanor took a sip of coffee and made a face. This is still dreadful. Yeah. I'll drink it anyway. Yeah. They sat in comfortable silence while the children played outside, running, shouting, throwing snowballs with the kind of energy that made adults tired just watching. "You didn't have to stay," Eleanor said finally. "I know." "Then why did you?" Mason didn't have a good answer, or maybe he did and didn't want to say it out loud. "Wanted to make sure you didn't need anything." "I don't." "I know that too." Eleanor's expression softened. "You're a terrible liar, Mr. Hale." "Never said I wasn't." She stood, brushing chalk dust from her skirt. "The children are coming back in. You should go. You have a ranch to run." Mason should have left, should have climbed on his horse and ridden back to work that actually mattered. Instead, he said, "I'll be back at 3 to drive you home." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, something complicated flickering across her face. "That's not necessary." "Didn't say it was." "Mr. Hale." 3 o'clock, Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her first name, the first time he'd let himself cross that particular line. She heard it. He saw the way her breath caught, the way her eyes widened just slightly. 3 o'clock, she agreed quietly. Mason left before he could say anything else stupid. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern Mason hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to handle. Eleanor taught during the day, pushing her students harder than they'd ever been pushed and somehow making them love her for it. She assigned homework that made parents grumble and children complain, but she also stayed late to help anyone who struggled, brought books from her personal collection for kids who showed interest in particular subjects, and treated every single student like they had potential worth developing. The town noticed. Attendance climbed. Parents who'd been skeptical started showing up at the schoolhouse to watch lessons through the windows. Even Brennan admitted, grudgingly, that Eleanor knew what she was doing. But it was the evenings that unsettled Mason. Eleanor would come home exhausted, her voice hoarse from a day of teaching, her hands stained with chalk and ink. She'd cook dinner, always insisting on contributing despite Mason's protests, and they'd eat together in a silence that had stopped feeling awkward and started feeling dangerous. Because somewhere along the way, Mason had stopped seeing her as a widow who needed help and started seeing her as Eleanor. Sharp, difficult, brilliant Eleanor, who made him laugh when he'd forgotten how, who called him on his bullshit with a precision that should have been annoying but wasn't, who looked at him like he was someone worth knowing instead of someone worth pitying. It scared the hell out of him. "You're staring," Eleanor said one evening, not looking up from the papers she was grading. "No, I'm not." "You are. You've been staring at me for the past 10 minutes. It's distracting." Mason forced his eyes back to the harness he was supposedly repairing. "Just thinking." "About?" "Nothing." "Another terrible lie." She set down her pen and looked at him directly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." "Mason." The sound of his first name in her voice did something to his chest he didn't want to examine too closely. "You're settling in. That's good." "That's not what's bothering you." "How do you know something's bothering me?" Eleanor's smile was small and knowing. "Because you've been avoiding eye contact for 3 days. Because you find excuses to leave the room when I'm in it. Because you're acting like a man who's realized something he doesn't want to admit. Mason set down the harness. Maybe I am. Then admit it. Can't. Why not? Because saying it out loud would make it real. Because real meant risk, and risk meant loss. And he'd already lost everyone he'd ever let himself care about. Just can't, he said finally. Eleanor studied him with those sharp eyes that saw too damn much. You know what I think, Mason? I think you're afraid. Of what? Of this. She gestured between them. Of whatever's been building between us since the night you found me at your gate. Of admitting that maybe you don't want to spend the rest of your life alone. You don't know what I want. Don't I? She stood, moving closer. You want connection. You want someone who sees you, really sees you, and doesn't flinch. You want what you lost when your wife died, but you're terrified that wanting it makes you weak. Mason's throat tightened. And what do you want, Eleanor? I want to survive. I want to build something that can't be taken away by a man's whim or society's judgment. I want... She stopped, something vulnerable flickering across her face. I want not to be alone anymore. But I'm also terrified. Because I'm 52 years old, Mason. Because you're younger than me. Because society would call this inappropriate. And part of me still cares what society thinks, even though I've tried very hard not to. I'm 47, Mason said. That's not that much younger. It's enough. And even if it wasn't, I'm a widow. You're a widower. We're both damaged people clinging to each other because we're lonely and scared. Is that what you think this is? Eleanor's eyes glistened. I don't know what this is. That's the problem. Mason stood, closing the distance between them. Then let me make it clear. I don't care that you're 52. I don't care what society thinks. I care that you make me want to wake up in the morning. I care that I can't stop thinking about you even when I'm supposed to be working. I care that for the first time in 3 years, I feel like maybe I'm not just surviving anymore. Eleanor's breath caught. Mason, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you to fix me or save me or any of that bullshit. I'm just asking if maybe we could stop pretending there's nothing here. The silence that followed was long enough that Mason started to think he'd made a terrible mistake. Then Eleanor reached up and touched his face, her hand cool and gentle against his jaw. I can't promise you anything. I can't promise I won't break again. I can't promise this won't end badly. I don't want promises. Then what do you want? Mason covered her hand with his own. Just this. Whatever this is, for as long as it lasts. Eleanor's eyes closed. When she opened them again, they were wet with tears she was too proud to let fall. That's the most honest thing anyone's ever said to me. You said that before. I meant it then, too. She kissed him, tentative at first, then deeper, with the kind of desperate hunger that came from years of loneliness finally breaking open. Mason pulled her closer, and she came willingly, her hands fisting in his shirt like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest. This is a terrible idea. Probably. People will talk. Let them. Cartwright will use it against me. He can try. Eleanor laughed, shaky and breathless. You're impossible. Yeah, Mason kissed the top of her head. You too. They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other like two people who'd forgotten how to be held. And for the first time since Catherine died, Mason let himself believe that maybe he deserved this. Maybe they both did. But Paradise Valley wasn't done testing them yet. The trouble started 2 weeks later when one of Eleanor's students, a 15-year-old named James Cartwright, Howard's nephew, stopped showing up to school. Eleanor noticed immediately. Where's James? She asked the other students. Uncomfortable silence. Someone tell me where James is. Finally, Patrick Sullivan spoke up, his voice quiet. His uncle said he doesn't need school anymore, said Mrs. Whitmore's teaching ideas that aren't proper. Eleanor's face went very still. What ideas specifically? Said you were teaching us that women can own property, that they can vote, that they don't have to obey their husbands if their husbands are wrong. Patrick looked down at his desk. My ma said that's all true, but Mr. Cartwright says it's dangerous. Mason, who'd come by to fix a broken window, saw the exact moment Eleanor decided to go to war. "Class dismissed early today," she said calmly. "Go home. We'll resume tomorrow." The children left, confused but obedient. Eleanor turned to Mason, her expression set. "I need to speak with Howard Cartwright." "That's a bad idea." "I don't care." "Eleanor, he's taking his nephew out of school because I'm teaching facts. Because I refuse to tell these children that half the population should accept subjugation as natural. If I let that stand, I'm worthless." She grabbed her coat. "Are you coming with me or not?" Mason should have talked her out of it, should have convinced her to wait, to approach this strategically. Instead, he grabbed his own coat. "I'm coming." They found Cartwright at the feed store, discussing grain prices with a customer. When he saw Eleanor, his expression curdled into something ugly. "Mrs. Whitmore, to what do I owe the displeasure?" "Your nephew hasn't attended school in 3 days," Eleanor said, her voice deadly calm. "I'd like to know why." "Because I don't want him exposed to your poison." "Poison?" "Your ideas, your Eastern notions about women's rights and social reform. This is Montana, Mrs. Whitmore. We have our own way of doing things." Eleanor stepped closer, and Mason saw the customer quietly excuse himself. "Let me be very clear, Mr. Cartwright. I am teaching children to read, write, and think critically. If you find that threatening, the problem isn't my teaching, it's your insecurity." Cartwright's face darkened. "You're teaching them to disrespect authority, to question their betters, to think they're entitled to things they haven't earned. I'm teaching them to think for themselves, something you clearly never learned." "Careful, Mrs. Whitmore. You're here on a trial basis. The board can end your employment at any time." "Then let them try." Eleanor's voice could have cut glass. "But understand this. You're not pulling your nephew from school because you're concerned about his education. You're doing it because you're a small, petty man who can't stand the thought of a woman succeeding where you failed." "I didn't fail at anything." "Didn't you? You failed to honor your promises. You failed to treat me with basic human decency. And now you're failing your nephew by denying him an education out of spite." She leaned in closer. "You're pathetic, Howard, and everyone in this town knows it." Cartwright's hand came up fast. Not quite a slap, but close enough that Mason moved without thinking, stepping between them with a grip on Cartwright's wrist that made the other man wince. "Don't," Mason said quietly. "This doesn't concern you, Hale." "It does now." Cartwright jerked his hand free, his face purple with rage. "You're making a mistake defending her. She's using you. Can't you see that? She's a bitter old woman who's decided to make everyone else as miserable as she is." "That's enough," Mason said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Is it? Or maybe you've just been alone so long you can't tell the difference between affection and manipulation anymore." Cartwright's smile was poisonous. "She doesn't care about you, Hale. She cares about having someone to hide behind while she wages her little war against propriety." Eleanor's voice cut through before Mason could respond. "You don't know anything about what I care about, but let me educate you. I care about children receiving the education they deserve. I care about women having choices beyond submission and silence. And I care about Mason Hale more than I've cared about anyone in years, which terrifies me, but I'm done letting fear dictate my decisions." The admission hung in the air like a challenge. Cartwright laughed, ugly and mean. "So that's what this is. The lonely widow and the grieving widower, playing house and pretending it's something noble. How touching." "Say whatever you want about me," Eleanor said coldly. "But I'm not withdrawing James from school. He's 15 years old. He deserves a chance to learn. If you can't see that, you're even more broken than I thought." "He's my nephew. I decide what's best for him." "Then you've decided wrong." Cartwright stepped closer, his voice dropping to something ugly. "I'll destroy you. I'll make sure every parent in this town pulls their children out. I'll make sure you lose everything you've built." Eleanor smiled, cold and sharp and absolutely fearless. "Try." They left Cartwright standing in his store, shaking with rage, and walked back to the schoolhouse in heavy silence. When they got there, Eleanor collapsed onto the steps, her hands trembling. "I shouldn't have done that." "You did exactly what you should have done. I made everything worse. He's going to go to the board. He's going to poison them against me." "Let him try." Eleanor looked up, her eyes wet. "You don't understand. I can't lose this, Mason. This school, these children, it's the first thing in my life that's felt like mine. If he takes it away, he won't. How do you know? Mason sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Because you're not alone anymore. Because this town sees what you're doing for their kids. Because Cartwright might have influence, but you've got something stronger. You've got respect. Respect isn't enough. It's a start. Eleanor leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. I'm scared. I know. I don't want to be scared anymore. Then stop fighting alone. Mason wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. Let me help. Let the people who believe in you help. Stop carrying everything yourself. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know how. You'll learn. She turned to look at him, and Mason saw the vulnerability she usually kept locked away. What if I fail? Then you fail, and you get up and try again, same as everyone else. That's not very comforting. Didn't say it was comforting, said it was true. Eleanor laughed, shaky but genuine. You're terrible at this. At what? Emotional support. Yeah, well, I've been out of practice. She kissed him then, soft and slow and filled with something that felt dangerously close to hope. When she pulled back, her eyes were clearer. Thank you. For what? For not letting me face him alone. For being here. She trailed off, searching for words. For making me believe this is possible. Mason didn't trust himself to speak, so he just held her closer and watched the sun set over the mountains, wondering how the hell he'd gotten so lucky and so terrified at the same time. The board meeting happened 3 days later. Cartwright came prepared with complaints from 3 families who'd pulled their children from school, citing Eleanor's inappropriate curriculum and unsuitable influence. He presented letters, testimony, and a long speech about the importance of traditional values. Eleanor sat in the front row, Mason beside her, and listened without expression. When Cartwright finished, Brennan turned to Eleanor. You want to respond to these accusations? I do. Eleanor stood, her voice calm and clear. Mr. Cartwright accuses me of teaching inappropriate material. Let me clarify what I'm actually teaching. Reading, writing, mathematics, geography, history, critical thinking. I teach my students to question information, to verify sources, to think independently. If that's inappropriate, then I'm guilty as charged. You're teaching them to disrespect authority, Cartwright interrupted. I'm teaching them to recognize the difference between authority and tyranny. There's a distinction. Murmurs ran through the crowd. The families who withdrew their children have that right, Eleanor continued. I won't argue with their decision, but I will argue with Mr. Cartwright's assertion that education should be limited to what makes adults comfortable. Children deserve better. They deserve teachers who challenge them, who expect more from them, who treat them like people capable of complex thought. You're indoctrinating them, Cartwright snapped. I'm educating them. You're the one who's afraid of what they might learn. Brennan held up a hand. Enough. Mrs. Whitmore, the board needs to know. Are you willing to modify your curriculum to address these concerns? Eleanor met his eyes steadily. No. Shocked silence. No? Brennan repeated. No. Because modifying my curriculum means lying to children. It means telling them that women can't own property when they legally can. It means pretending that critical thinking is dangerous when it's essential. It means compromising my integrity to appease adults who are more interested in control than education. She took a breath. If that's what this town wants, then you should find another teacher. But I won't do it. Mason's hand found hers under the table, squeezing tight. Brennan looked at the other board members, then back at Eleanor. You're asking us to choose between you and the families who've complained. I'm asking you to choose what's right for your children. The rest will sort itself out. And if we choose to end your employment? Eleanor's smile was small and sad. Then I'll know I tried. That's more than I had 6 months ago. The room fell silent, waiting for Brennan's decision. He looked at his wife, at Mary Sullivan, at the other parents who'd stayed through the meeting, their faces uncertain but not hostile. Finally, he sighed. Board's decision stands. Mrs. Whitmore keeps her position. Families who want to withdraw their children can do so. Everyone else can make their own choice. Cartwright exploded. This is outrageous. She's poisoning this town with her Eastern ideas. She's teaching our kids to read, Howard, and she's doing a damn good job of it. Brennan stood. Meetings adjourned. The crowd dispersed slowly. Some people congratulating Eleanor, others leaving quickly with tight expressions. Cartwright stormed out without another word. Eleanor stood in the emptying room, her hand still gripping Mason's like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You won," Mason said quietly. "For now. That's all anyone gets. For now." Eleanor turned to him, and the tears she'd been holding back finally broke free. "I was so scared." "I know. I thought I'd lose everything again. But you didn't." She leaned into him, and Mason held her while she shook with exhaustion and relief and the aftermath of adrenaline. Around them, the schoolhouse emptied until it was just the two of them in the lamplight, holding each other like two people who'd finally found solid ground after years of drowning. "Take me home," Eleanor whispered. Mason did, and for the first time neither of them questioned where home was anymore. Winter came hard that year, burying Paradise Valley under 3 feet of snow and cutting them off from the outside world for weeks at a time. Eleanor moved through those frozen months with the kind of fierce determination that made even the weather seem like a minor inconvenience. School continued, children trudging through snowdrifts to reach the warmth of the schoolhouse, where Eleanor had somehow turned basic education into something they actually wanted. The ranch house changed too. Small things at first. Curtains Eleanor sewed from fabric she'd bought with her first month's salary, a bookshelf Mason built to hold her growing collection, the way they'd stopped pretending to sleep in separate spaces and just accepted that they gravitated toward each other in the dark. They didn't talk about what they were, didn't put labels on the thing growing between them. They just lived it. Mason would wake before dawn to find Eleanor already dressed, preparing lessons by lamplight with a focus that reminded him of soldiers before battle. She'd kiss him goodbye, quick and matter-of-fact, and he'd drive her to the schoolhouse before heading out to check fence lines and livestock. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, Eleanor grading papers, Mason repairing tack or sharpening tools. Sometimes they'd talk, long conversations about everything and nothing. Sometimes they'd just exist in comfortable silence. It was the closest thing to peace Mason had felt in years. But peace, he'd learned, never lasted long. The letter arrived in late February, carried by a messenger who'd fought through the snow from town. Eleanor opened it at the kitchen table, her hand steady until she read the first line. Then they started shaking. "What is it?" Mason asked. "Mason." She didn't answer for a long moment, just stared at the paper like it might catch fire if she looked away. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. "My late husband's estate. There was a legal challenge. His brother claimed everything was rightfully his. The courts have been reviewing the case for over a year. And they've ruled in my favor." Eleanor set down the letter carefully, precisely. "The estate is mine. The house in Boston, the investments, everything. She laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "I'm wealthy again." Mason felt something cold settle in his chest. "That's good news." "Is it?" "You get back everything you lost. Your security, your status." "Yes." Eleanor's eyes met his, and he saw the terror there. "And the lawyers need me in Boston immediately to finalize the transfer. They say if I don't appear within 6 weeks, the ruling could be challenged again." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. "When do you leave?" Mason asked, his voice carefully empty. "I don't know. I can't just abandon the school. The children will understand." "Mason, you have to go, Eleanor. This is everything you said you wanted. Security, independence, a life that can't be taken away." Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Pretend you're fine with this. Pretend it doesn't matter." "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to be honest." Her voice cracked. "I want you to tell me what you're thinking instead of shutting down like you do every time something matters." Mason stood too, his hands clenched at his sides. "You want honesty? Fine. I think you should go. I think you should take your estate and your status and everything you're owed. I think you should go back to Boston, where you belong, and build the life you deserve." "And what about this? What about us?" There is no us, Eleanor. There's a widow and a widower who kept each other warm through a bad winter. That's all. The words were meant to hurt, meant to push her away before she could leave on her own. Eleanor's face went white. You're lying. I'm being realistic. You're being a coward. She moved closer, her eyes blazing. You're trying to make this easier by pretending it doesn't matter, by convincing yourself that what we have isn't real. It's not real. It's survival. We latched onto each other because we were both drowning, but that doesn't make it love. Don't tell me what I feel. Eleanor's voice dropped to something dangerous. I'm 52 years old, Mason. I've been married. I've had children. I know the difference between convenience and connection. And this, she gestured between them, this is real. It's messy and complicated and terrifying, but it's real. Mason's throat tightened. Then what do you want from me? I want you to ask me to stay. I can't do that. Why not? Because I won't be the reason you give up everything you've worked for. I won't be the man who held you back from the life you deserve. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. So instead, you'll be the man who pushed me away because you're too afraid to fight for something good. I'm not afraid. You're terrified. You've been terrified since the night you found me at your gate. Terrified that caring about me means risking the kind of loss you swore you'd never survive again. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the tears she refused to let fall. But here's what you don't understand. Pushing me away doesn't protect you from loss. It just guarantees it happens on your terms instead of life's. Mason wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the walls he'd spent 3 years building. But standing there, looking at Eleanor's face, fierce and vulnerable and absolutely unafraid of the truth, he couldn't. I don't know how to do this, he said finally, his voice raw. I don't know how to let myself want something when I know it might get taken away. Neither do I. Eleanor's hand found his face, gentle despite the anger still simmering in her eyes. But I'm willing to try anyway. The question is, are you? Mason closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. What if you go to Boston and realize you don't want to come back? What if you get there and remember what it's like to have money and status and a life that doesn't involve freezing your ass off in Montana? Then I'll write you a letter and tell you the truth. And it'll hurt. And we'll both survive it. She made him look at her. But what if I go to Boston and realize that everything I thought I wanted doesn't mean anything without you? What if I come back? That's a big what if. Everything worth having is a big what if, Mason. He kissed her then, desperate and hungry and full of every emotion he'd been trying to bury. Eleanor kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands fisting in his shirt like she could hold him in place through sheer will. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I can't ask you to stay, but I can ask you to come back. Is that what you want? Yeah, that's what I want. Eleanor's smile was shaky but real. Then I'll come back. I promise. Don't make promises you might not be able to keep. I'm not. I'm making a promise I intend to keep, even if I don't know how yet. She left 2 weeks later on the first stage that could make it through the mountain passes. The whole town turned out to say goodbye, children crying, parents thanking her for what she'd given their kids. Even Brennan grudgingly admitting she'd done good work. Eleanor stood in the schoolhouse one last time, looking at the space she'd transformed from a ruin into something alive. Mrs. Henderson will take over until I return, she told the assembled students. You'll listen to her the way you listen to me. You'll work hard. You'll ask questions. And when I come back, she had to stop, her voice threatening to break. When I come back, you'll tell me everything you learned. Mary Sullivan stepped forward, pressing a package into Eleanor's hands. From all of us. So you don't forget. Inside was a quilt, crude but heartfelt, each square sewn by a different family with their names stitched in uneven letters. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. I could never forget any of you. Mason drove her to the stage stop, neither of them speaking until the coach appeared in the distance. This isn't goodbye, Eleanor said firmly. It's just a pause. Yeah, I mean it, Mason. I'm coming back. I know. Do you? Or are you already convincing yourself that I won't? Mason looked at her, really looked, memorizing the way the winter light caught her gray hair, the stubborn set of her jaw, the eyes that had seen too much and refused to close anyway. "I'm trying to believe you," he said honestly. "That's the best I can do." Eleanor kissed him, soft and lingering. "Then I'll have to come back and prove it." The stage arrived. Mason loaded her single bag, still the same worn leather case she'd carried that first night. She climbed aboard, and he watched through the window as she settled into her seat, spine straight and chin high, even though he could see her hands shaking. The driver snapped the reins, the stage lurched forward, and Eleanor was gone. Mason stood in the road long after the dust settled, the cold seeping through his coat, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life by letting her go. The weeks that followed were the longest of Mason's existence. He threw himself into ranch work, repairing everything that had been neglected, expanding the herd, working from dawn until he was too exhausted to think. The house felt too quiet without Eleanor's presence. Her books still lined the shelf, her apron still hung by the door. Small reminders that she'd been real, that the past months hadn't been some fever dream born of loneliness. The schoolhouse stayed open under Mrs. Henderson's management, but it wasn't the same. The children noticed. Parents noticed. Even Brennan mentioned in passing that the town missed Eleanor's particular brand of strict encouragement. "She coming back?" he asked Mason one day at the general store. "Says she is." "You believe her?" Mason didn't answer right away. "I'm trying to." Brennan nodded slowly. "That's something, I guess." The first letter arrived 3 weeks after Eleanor left. Mason's hand shook as he opened it, standing in the kitchen where they'd shared so many meals. "Dearest Mason, Boston is exactly as I remembered. Cold, gray, and full of people who mistake politeness for kindness. The estate is larger than I expected. The legal proceedings more complex. The lawyers informed me it could take months to fully settle everything. I attended a dinner party last night, my first social engagement in over a year. I was surrounded by people I once considered friends, women who smiled to my face and whispered behind their hands about my age, my absence, my audacity in returning. One asked, with exquisite condescension, whether I'd enjoyed my adventure in the wilderness. I told her it was the most honest 6 months of my life. She didn't understand. None of them do. They look at me like I'm a curiosity, the widow who vanished west and came back wealthy. They want to know if I'll resume my place in society, host parties, marry appropriately. I want to tell them I've already found something far more valuable than their approval. The house is beautiful and empty. I walk through rooms I once filled with meaningless objects and feel nothing. At night, I sit in the library and grade imaginary papers because my hands don't know what to do without chalk dust. I miss the children. I miss the schoolhouse. I miss the mountains. I miss you. Tell me about the ranch. Tell me about Paradise Valley. Tell me everything that's happening so I can remember why I'm fighting to get back. Yours, Eleanor Mason read the letter 3 times before he could convince himself to put it down. Then he sat at the table with paper and ink and wrote back, clumsy and honest, telling her about spring starting to break through the snow, about Patrick Sullivan asking when Mrs. Whitmore would return, about the way the ranch felt like it was waiting for something. More letters followed. Eleanor's detailed and eloquent, Mason's shorter but no less genuine. They wrote about everything, the mundane and the meaningful, the funny and the frightening. Eleanor described legal battles and social warfare with the same dry humor she'd used to describe the Montana frontier. Mason told her about fence repairs and livestock, with a candor he'd never managed with anyone else. Between the lines, they said what they couldn't quite say directly. "I need you. I'm fighting to get back to you. Wait for me." "I'm waiting." But as weeks turned into months, Mason felt the doubt creeping in. Eleanor had money now, status, everything she'd lost when her husband died. She was attending parties, reconnecting with her daughters, rebuilding a life in Boston. Why would she give that up for a rundown ranch in Montana and a broken man who still couldn't say the word love without his throat closing up? The answer came in early May, carried by a telegram that made Mason's heart stop. Legal matters concluded. Stop. Estate secured. Stop. Offered position on charitable board. Stop. Salary $5,000 annually. Stop. Society welcomes my return. Stop. Decision required immediately. Stop! What should I do? Stop! Mason stared at the telegram for a long time, the paper crinkling in his grip. $5,000. More money than most people in Paradise Valley would see in a lifetime. Security, respect, everything Eleanor had said she wanted, everything she deserved. He could write back and tell her to stay. Could beg her to choose the life she'd fought so hard to reclaim. Could let her go for real this time. Instead, Mason sat down and composed his response, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Choose yourself. Stop. Choose what makes you whole. Stop. I will be here either way. Stop. M. He sent it before he could second-guess himself and then waited. 1 day passed. Then 2. Then a week. No response. Mason tried not to think about what that meant. Tried not to imagine Eleanor in Boston, surrounded by society and wealth, realizing that Montana had been a temporary escape from reality instead of a permanent choice. On the 8th day, he stopped checking for telegrams. On the 9th day, he started accepting that she wasn't coming back. On the 10th day, he came home from checking the north pasture to find Eleanor sitting on his porch. She looked different, clothes too fine for Montana, hair styled instead of pinned back practical, but her eyes were the same, sharp, fierce, absolutely unafraid. Mason stopped walking, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "You're here," he said stupidly. "I'm here." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirts with nervous hands. I turned down the charitable board. I signed the estate over to my daughters, kept enough to live on, but the rest is theirs. I burned most of my bridges in Boston by telling certain people exactly what I thought of their values. She took a breath. And then I came home. This isn't your home. Yes, it is. It has been since the night you found me at your gate. Mason climbed the porch steps slowly, still not quite believing she was real. You gave up $5,000. I gave up a life that didn't fit anymore. Eleanor, let me finish. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd always used. I went back to Boston thinking I'd reclaim everything I'd lost. And I did. The money, the status, the social standing, I got it all back. And standing in that enormous empty house, surrounded by people who smiled while they judged me, I realized something. What? That I didn't want any of it. Not without you, not without the children, not without the life we'd started building together. Her voice broke slightly. I don't need wealth or status or society's approval, Mason. I need a place where I can teach, where I can build something real, where I can wake up next to someone who sees me, all of me, and doesn't flinch. Mason's throat was so tight he could barely breathe. You could have had everything. I already have everything. I just had to go back to Boston to realize it. She took his hands, her grip strong despite the trembling. I love you. I think I've loved you since you let me stay that first night, even though every instinct told you not to. I love your stubbornness and your honesty and the way you fix broken things without making a fuss about it. I love that you let me be angry and difficult and sharp without trying to soften my edges. Eleanor, I'm not finished. I love you, and I'm asking, no, I'm demanding that you let yourself love me back, that you stop protecting yourself from loss and just let this be real. Mason pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, his whole body shaking. I'm terrified. Good. So am I. What if no what ifs, no more fear. Just us, right now, choosing each other. She pulled back enough to look at him. Can you do that? Mason kissed her instead of answering, deep and desperate, and full of every emotion he'd spent months trying to contain. Eleanor kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands framing his face like he was something precious she'd finally been allowed to keep. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I love you. I don't know how to do this right, and I'll probably mess it up, but I love you. Eleanor's smile was radiant. That's all I needed to hear. Marry me. The words came out before Mason could stop them, raw and unplanned and absolutely genuine. Eleanor went very still. What? Marry me. Not because society expects it, not because you need security, but because I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. Because I want to build something with you that can't be taken away. He swallowed hard. Because I'm done being afraid. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Yes. Yes? Yes, you impossible man. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it. Mason kissed her again, and this time it felt like a promise, like a beginning instead of an ending. They stood on the porch as the sun set over the mountains, holding each other like two people who'd finally found solid ground after years of drowning. When? Eleanor asked finally. Whenever you want. Tomorrow. Mason laughed. Tomorrow? Why wait? We're both old enough to know what we want. Let's just do it. The town's going to talk. Let them. I'm done caring what people think. Fair enough. Mason pulled her closer. Tomorrow it is. Eleanor kissed him once more, soft and lingering. I can't believe I'm home. Neither can I. But standing there with Eleanor in his arms, the Montana sky turning purple and gold above them, Mason finally let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they deserved this. Winter deepened, and Eleanor's school thrived despite Cartwright's continued efforts to undermine her. 3 families had withdrawn their children, but 7 new ones enrolled, drawn by word of mouth about the woman who taught mathematics with the precision of a banker and literature with the passion of someone who'd lived through every heartbreak she assigned. Mason watched her transform from the exhausted widow at his gate into something he didn't quite have words for. Not softer, Eleanor would never be soft, but more present, more alive, like she'd been holding her breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. They fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and impossible. Mornings, Mason would drive her to the schoolhouse, the wagon rattling over frozen ground while Eleanor reviewed lesson plans and muttered about curriculum adjustments. Evenings, they'd return to the ranch, where Eleanor would grade papers while Mason tended livestock, both of them moving around each other with the careful choreography of people learning to share space they'd protected for too long. They didn't talk about what they were to each other, didn't define it or name it, but Mason knew, even if he couldn't say it out loud, that somewhere between October and December, between survival and connection, he'd fallen in love with her. It terrified him, because loving someone meant losing them, and he'd already buried everyone he'd ever loved. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late January, delivered by a courier who looked too well dressed for Paradise Valley. Eleanor accepted it at the schoolhouse door, her face going pale as she recognized the seal. "What is it?" Mason asked, watching her hand shake as she broke the wax. "My husband's estate." Her voice was distant, mechanical. "His brother died last month. The estate lawyers have been reviewing the succession." She read in silence, her eyes moving faster with each line. When she looked up, her expression was blank. "They've restored my claim. The house, the investments, everything my husband took from me. It's mine again." Mason's stomach dropped. That's good, isn't it?" "I don't know." Eleanor stared at the letter like it was written in a language she'd forgotten how to read. "They want me in Boston. Immediately. To sign documents, claim the estate, settle affairs. How long would that take?" "Weeks, maybe months, depending on complications." She folded the letter carefully, her movements precise. "I'd have to leave." The words hung between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying. "When?" Mason asked. "They've sent tickets for the next eastbound train. 3 days from now." 3 days. Mason felt something crack in his chest. "You should go." Eleanor looked at him sharply. "Should I?" "It's your estate, your money. Everything you lost, you can get it back. And if I don't want it back?" "Eleanor, I spent 30 years in that world, Mason. In houses too big to feel like home, at parties where everyone smiled and no one told the truth, married to a man who saw me as a decorative addition to his life. That estate represents everything I've been trying to escape." Her voice cracked. "Why would I want to go back?" "Because it's yours, because you earned it, because—" Mason stopped, the words sticking in his throat. "Because what?" Because he was afraid. Because if she stayed, he'd have to admit what she meant to him, and admitting it meant risking the kind of loss that had nearly destroyed him 3 years ago. "Because you deserve better than this," he said finally. "Better than a half-finished ranch and a man who can barely string 2 words together. You could have everything you lost: security, status, a real life. Eleanor's face went very still. Is that what you think this is? Not a real life? I think you're settling because you don't have other options. Settling. She repeated the word like it tasted bitter. I rebuilt a school with my bare hands. I fought for the right to teach children that their lives could be more than what circumstance handed them. I found something resembling happiness with you, and you think I'm settling? You could have more. I don't want more. The words came out sharp enough to cut. I want this. The schoolhouse, the children, this town that drives me insane half the time, but at least treats me like I matter. I want you, Mason, even though you're too stubborn to believe it. Mason's throat tightened. What happens when you realize you made a mistake? When you wake up one day and remember what you gave up to stay here? What happens when you stop punishing yourself for surviving? Eleanor shot back. What happens when you let yourself believe that maybe, just maybe, you deserve to be happy? I don't. Yes, you do. You deserve happiness just as much as I do. But you're so terrified of losing it that you'd rather push me away than risk finding out what we could be together. She was right. She was completely, devastatingly right. And Mason had no idea how to tell her that without falling apart. Go to Boston, he said quietly. Settle your affairs. Figure out what you really want without me confusing things. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. And if what I want is here, then you'll come back. Will I? She picked up the letter, her hand steadier now. Or will I get there and realize that leaving was the right choice? That staying here was just temporary insanity brought on by loneliness and desperation? I don't know. Neither do I. That's what terrifies me. She walked out of the schoolhouse without another word, leaving Mason alone with the echoes of everything he couldn't bring himself to say. That night, they ate dinner in silence so heavy it felt like drowning. Eleanor pushed food around her plate without eating. Mason did the same. Finally, she spoke. I'm going to Boston. Mason's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Okay. I have to. The lawyers were very clear. If I don't appear, I forfeit the claim. And despite what you think, I'm not foolish enough to walk away from that much money without at least seeing what my options are. That's smart. Is it? Eleanor set down her fork, her eyes hard. Or is it cowardice? Running back to the life I escaped because the alternative is too frightening. You're not running. Aren't I? I'm leaving the school, the children, you. I'm getting on a train and going back to a world I claim to hate, and part of me is relieved. Because staying here means admitting what I feel for you, and that's terrifying. Mason forced himself to meet her eyes. What do you feel for me? The question hung between them like a challenge. Eleanor's hands trembled. I feel like I've finally found something worth fighting for, and I'm furious with myself for being too scared to say it out loud. Eleanor, don't! She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Don't tell me it'll be fine. Don't tell me to go with your blessing. If you want me to stay, Mason, you have to say it. You have to tell me I matter more than your fear of losing me. Mason opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Eleanor's face crumpled. That's what I thought. She climbed the ladder to the loft and Mason sat alone at the table, hating himself more than he'd hated anything in 3 years. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor arranged for a substitute teacher, Mary Sullivan, who was terrified but willing. She wrote detailed lesson plans, organized materials, and said goodbye to students who cried and begged her not to leave. Mason helped her pack, his movements mechanical. They barely spoke except to coordinate logistics. The silence between them had shifted from comfortable to unbearable. On the morning of her departure, Mason drove her to the train station. Eleanor sat beside him in her traveling dress, the same worn wool she'd arrived in, her face carefully blank. You'll write? Mason asked, the words scraping out of him like gravel. If you want me to. I want you to. Eleanor nodded but didn't look at him. I don't know when I'll be back, or if I'll be back. I know. I need you to understand, if I stay in Boston, it's not because I don't care about you. It's because I've spent my entire life making choices based on what other people needed. For once, I want to make a choice based on what I need, even if that choice hurts. Mason's hands tightened on the reins. And if what you need is there, Then I'll stay there. And if it's here? Eleanor finally turned to look at him, and Mason saw everything she'd been trying to hide: pain, hope, love she was too afraid to name. Then I'll come back, and you'll have to decide if you're brave enough to let me stay. They reached the station. Mason helped her down, carried her bags to the platform. The train was already there, steam rising into the cold morning air. Eleanor stood on the platform, one hand on her bag, looking at Mason like she was memorizing his face. I should go, she said. Yeah. Mason, don't. His voice cracked. Don't say goodbye. Just go. Figure out what you want. I'll be here. Eleanor's eyes filled. Will you? I don't know how to be anywhere else. She nodded, then turned and boarded the train without looking back. Mason stood on the platform until the train disappeared into the distance, carrying Eleanor back to a life she'd tried so hard to escape. Then he climbed into the wagon and drove home through snow that had started falling like the world was trying to bury everything. The ranch felt emptier than it had in 3 years. Mason threw himself into work, repairing fences, tending livestock, chopping enough firewood to last through 3 winters. Anything to avoid thinking about the fact that Eleanor was gone and might not come back. Weeks passed with no word. Mason told himself it was because she was busy, because settling an estate took time, because she was figuring out what she wanted without the distraction of Montana complicating things. He didn't let himself think about the alternative, that she'd gotten to Boston, remembered what it felt like to have money and status and security, and decided Paradise Valley wasn't worth the sacrifice. Then, 6 weeks after Eleanor left, a letter arrived. Mason stared at it for 10 minutes before opening it, his hands shaking so badly he almost tore the paper. The handwriting was Eleanor's, precise, elegant, unmistakable. Mason, I've settled my late husband's estate. The house has been sold, the investments liquidated, the debts cleared. I am, by all legal measures, a wealthy woman. I could live comfortably in Boston for the rest of my life. I could travel. I could do anything I want. The problem is, I know exactly what I want. And it's not here. I'm writing this from the home I grew up in, or what's left of it. My father sold it years ago, but I wanted to see it one more time before I left. I stood in the rooms where I learned to read, where I planned my future, where I believed the world was full of possibilities. And all I could think about was your ranch, your terrible coffee, the schoolhouse with its leaking roof and stubborn children, you sitting across from me at dinner, pretending you're not watching me grade papers. I thought coming back here would remind me of who I was before everything fell apart. Instead, it reminded me of who I've become. And I like that person, Mason. She's difficult and stubborn and too old to care what anyone thinks. She's found something worth fighting for in a town that barely wanted her. She's found you. I'm coming back. Not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I'm settling, but because Montana is where I want to be. The schoolhouse is where I belong. And you're the first person in 30 years who's made me feel like I'm enough exactly as I am. I'll arrive on the evening train, March 8th. If you're there, I'll know you meant what you said about being here. If you're not, I'll understand. I'll still come back to the schoolhouse. I'll still teach. I'll still rebuild my life in Paradise Valley. But I hope you're there. Eleanor Mason read the letter 3 times, his throat tight and his eyes burning. March 8th was 2 days away. He spent those 2 days in a state of controlled panic. He cleaned the ranch house, really cleaned it, for the first time since Catherine died. He fixed everything that had been broken, patched everything that had been leaking, made the place look like somewhere a person could actually live instead of just survive. Then he rode into town and found Thomas Brennan at the feed store. I need to ask you something, Mason said without preamble. Brennan looked up from his ledger. About Mrs. Whitmore. How'd you know? Because you look like a man about to do something either very stupid or very brave. With you two, it's usually both. Brennan set down his pen. What do you need? Permission to marry her, if she'll have me. Brennan raised an eyebrow. You asking me for permission? Why? Because you're on the school board, because she cares about this town and what people think, even when she pretends she doesn't. Because Mason stopped, searching for words. Because I don't want her to have to choose between me and the life she's built here. If people have a problem with us, I need to know now. Brennan studied him for a long moment. You love her? Yeah. She love you? I think so. Hope so. Then you've got my blessing, for what it's worth. Brennan smiled. She's good for you, Hale. You're less of a ghost than you were 6 months ago. She's good for everyone. That too. Mason left the feed store and spent the rest of the day preparing for Eleanor's arrival. He bought flowers from the general store, the only bouquet they had, half wilted, but better than nothing. He borrowed a suit from Brennan that almost fit. He practiced what he was going to say until the words lost all meaning. By the time evening came, he'd abandoned the suit in favor of his cleanest shirt and given the flowers to Mary Sullivan because they made him look ridiculous. He stood on the train platform alone, watching the sun set behind the mountains, wondering if Eleanor would actually be on that train or if the letter had been her way of saying goodbye. The train arrived right on schedule, steam and noise and the screech of brakes. Passengers started disembarking, farmers returning from business trips, families visiting relatives, a handful of drifters looking for work, and then Eleanor. She stepped onto the platform in her traveling dress, one bag in hand, her hair pulled back and her face tired but determined. She looked older than she had when she left, the lines around her eyes deeper, her movement slower. But when she saw Mason waiting, her entire face transformed. She didn't run. Eleanor would never run. But she walked quickly, her step sure, and when she reached him, she dropped her bag and threw her arms around his neck like she was afraid he'd disappear if she didn't hold on tight enough. Mason caught her, pulling her close, and felt something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 3 years finally loosen. "You came back," he said into her hair. "I told you I would." "I know, but I wasn't sure." Eleanor pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes wet. "Did you really think I'd stay there, in that life, after everything? I thought maybe you'd remember what it felt like to have security, money, a future that didn't involve freezing your ass off in Montana every winter. I don't want security if it means giving up everything that matters." She cupped his face with both hands. "You matter, Mason. This place matters. The school matters. I'm not leaving again, not unless you tell me to." Mason's throat closed. "I'm not telling you to leave. I'm asking you to stay. Permanently." Eleanor's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you. I'm saying I want you here, not as a tenant or a housekeeper or someone passing through. I want you as my wife, if you'll have me." "Mason, I know I'm not easy to live with. I know I'm damaged and stubborn and terrible at talking about anything that matters. But I also know that since the day you walked through my gate, I've been more alive than I've been in 3 years. You make me want to be better. You make me believe I can be better." Eleanor was crying now, real tears, the kind she never let anyone see. "I'm 52 years old. So? I'm difficult, stubborn. I don't know how to compromise." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out. I can't give you children. I don't want children. I want you." She laughed through her tears. "You're insane." "Probably. Is that a yes?" Eleanor kissed him, desperate and messy and perfect. When she pulled back, she was smiling. "Yes, it's a yes." Mason kissed her again, and the handful of people still on the platform started clapping. Eleanor buried her face in his chest, embarrassed but laughing, and Mason held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had spent 3 years trying to pull him under. They were married 2 weeks later in the schoolhouse, with half the town in attendance and the children sitting in the front row. Mary Sullivan cried. Thomas Brennan gave a speech about second chances. Even some of the families who'd withdrawn their children showed up, drawn by curiosity and grudging respect. Howard Cartwright didn't attend. Nobody expected him to. Eleanor wore a dress she'd bought in Boston, simple, elegant, cream-colored instead of white, because she refused to pretend this was her first wedding or that she was anything other than what she was. Mason wore the borrowed suit and felt ridiculous, but Eleanor said he looked handsome, so he didn't argue. When Brennan, who'd been ordained years ago for reasons nobody quite remembered, asked if they took each other for better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and health, Eleanor looked at Mason with eyes that held everything they'd survived to get here. "I do," she said. "I do," Mason echoed. And when they kissed, the schoolhouse erupted in applause and cheering that shook the rafters. The years that followed weren't easy. Eleanor continued teaching, pushing her students harder than they wanted, and watching them grow into people who could think for themselves. She wrote curriculum that other schools started adopting. She brought in visiting lecturers, organized debates, turned the schoolhouse into something that mattered beyond Paradise Valley. Mason expanded the ranch, hired help for the first time in years, started selling cattle to markets as far as Denver. He built additions to the house, a proper library for Eleanor's books, a study where she could work, a porch where they could sit together and watch the seasons change. They fought. Eleanor had a temper, and Mason could be impossibly stubborn, and sometimes they'd go days barely speaking because both of them were too proud to apologize first. But they always came back to each other, always found their way through the anger to the understanding beneath it. Because beneath everything, the fights and the frustration and the daily grind of building a life together, was something neither of them had expected to find again. Love. Real, complicated, imperfect love that didn't fix them but gave them a reason to try. 5 years after Eleanor arrived at Mason's Gate, the schoolhouse had doubled in size. 10 years later, it had become a regional school with students coming from 3 counties. Eleanor hired 2 assistant teachers, then 4, then 6. She wrote textbooks that were used across Montana and Wyoming. She became known as the woman who'd transformed education in Paradise Valley, not through politics or money, but through sheer stubborn refusal to accept anything less than excellence. People stopped mentioning her age, stopped talking about how inappropriate it was for a widow to remarry so soon, or for a woman to teach ideas that challenged the status quo. Eleanor had become too essential, too respected, too powerful in her own right for the gossip to stick. She'd become exactly what she'd fought to be, a woman defined by her own choices instead of other people's judgments. Mason watched her transformation with something close to awe. The exhausted widow at his gate had become this force of nature who ran school board meetings like military operations and stared down county officials who tried to cut her funding. She was magnificent and terrifying, and he loved her more with each passing year. On their 10th anniversary, Mason came home to find Eleanor sitting on the porch, a letter in her hands and tears on her face. He dropped beside her, heart racing. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She held up the letter. "It's from James, Howard Cartwright's nephew." The name still carried weight, even though Cartwright himself had left Paradise Valley years ago, his reputation destroyed and his business failed. "What's he want?" Mason asked carefully. "To thank me." Eleanor's voice cracked. "He's graduating from university next month. He's going to be a teacher. He says—" She had to stop, overcome. "He says I saved his life, that if I hadn't fought for him to stay in school, he would have ended up like his uncle, bitter and small and afraid of anyone smarter than him." Mason put his arm around her. "You did save him. You saved a lot of them." "I just taught them to read." "You taught them to think. That's bigger than reading." Eleanor leaned into him, her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember when you asked me what I wanted, that night in the schoolhouse?" "Yeah. I said I wanted to survive, to build something that couldn't be taken away, to not be alone." She looked up at him, her eyes wet but bright. "I got all of that, and more than I ever imagined." "Me too." They sat in silence, watching the sun set over Paradise Valley. The mountains rose dark against the pink and gold sky. Somewhere in the distance, children were playing. The schoolhouse bell rang, Eleanor's assistant dismissing the last class of the day. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Letting me stay? Marrying me? All of it?" Mason considered the question seriously. Thought about the 3 years before Eleanor, the isolation, the grief, the slow decay of a man who'd forgotten how to live. Then he thought about everything after, the fights and the laughter, and the daily work of building something together. The way Eleanor had forced him to remember that surviving wasn't the same as living. The way she'd made him believe he deserved happiness even after loss. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it. Any of it. Not even when I'm difficult? Especially not then." Eleanor laughed, the same laugh he'd heard that first night, surprised and genuine. "You're a terrible liar, Mason Hale." "Yeah, you've mentioned that before." She kissed him, soft and slow and filled with 10 years of choosing each other every single day. When she pulled back, her expression was serious. "I love you. I don't say it enough. but I do. I know. Good. She stood, pulling him up with her. Come inside. I made dinner and it's getting cold. You're cooking or mine? Mine, which means it's actually edible. They walked inside together, and through the window Mason could see the valley spreading out below them, the town they'd helped build, the school that bore Eleanor's mark, the life they'd created from broken pieces. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated and sometimes harder than either of them wanted to admit. But it was theirs, and that, Mason thought as he followed Eleanor into their home, was more than he'd ever hoped to have again. Years later, when people told the story of Lady Eleanor Whitmore, the widow who'd transformed Paradise Valley's education system, who'd fought for children's right to think freely, who'd built an empire of learning from a broken schoolhouse and sheer determination, they always mentioned Mason Hale. Not as the man who saved her, not as the hero who rescued the damsel, but as the man who'd recognized her strength when everyone else saw only age and loss. The man who'd stood beside her when it would have been easier to walk away. The man who'd loved her not despite her difficulty, but because of it. And when people asked Eleanor about her greatest accomplishment, the schools, the books, the thousands of students who'd passed through her classrooms, she always gave the same answer. I learned to choose myself. Everything else followed from that. Then she'd smile, that sharp smile that had terrified and inspired generations of students, and add, though marrying Mason helped, he's terrible at emotional support, but he makes excellent coffee, eventually. The schoolhouse still stands in Paradise Valley, though it's been expanded so many times the original building is barely recognizable. There's a plaque by the door that reads, Founded by Eleanor Whitmore, 1875. A woman who refused to accept that age, loss, or society's judgment could define her worth. And on the ranch at the edge of town, in a house that's been added to and improved over decades, there's a porch where two chairs sit side by side facing the mountains. They're empty now, have been for years. But the town still calls it the Hale Whitmore Ranch, still tells stories about the widow and the widower who found each other when both had given up on finding anything, still teaches Eleanor's curriculum in schools across 3 states, because some stories aren't about rescue or redemption. They're about 2 broken people who decided that broken didn't mean finished, who built something real from loneliness and stubbornness and the daily choice to show up for each other even when it was hard, who proved that love doesn't have an expiration date, that second chances don't come with age limits, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is refuse to accept the story other people write for them. Eleanor and Mason wrote their own story, and it was worth every difficult, beautiful, imperfect moment.